In this week's episode, we will be starting a new series where we will go over all my layers and how I executed my latest artwork, Dreamy Night. I used only 13 stock images for this artwork, which is a personal best for me because I usually use between 30 and 50 stock images. The inspiration for this piece came from a commissioned artwork. I made this song cover for an artist and then recreated it for the channel, adding some additional elements at the end. With that being said, let's get into it. Okay, so now we're in the artwork file. We're just going to go over the entire process of how I designed it from the very first step until even color grading. So all the elements in this artwork, I have them organized for you right here in the layers section. I have them all categorized into groups for each element. So we're first going to start off from the very bottom and make our way all the way to the top till we finally get to the final art piece. When starting this piece, I knew I wanted a dark background. I knew the color scheme was going to be a bluish tone. Going into here for the wall, I selected this dark bluish purple color because I knew that's what color scheme I was going to go for. After that, the first thing I did was start my window. I needed to get a basis of where the focal point of the composition was going to be, and I decided to go with this windowsill. Okay, so here's a windowsill that I started with, but basically I started off with this, and as soon as I started off with this, I actually decided to design the scenery that was going to be through the window, just so I know how the lighting's going to work and the colors and all that stuff. So basically I started off with the windowsill, placed it where I think it was going to best fit for the composition. Then I started with the scenery. So the first part, I added this sky right here. So this is the same image that I used in my space station art piece. If you haven't seen that, go on my Instagram and check it out. So basically this is what it was. I started off with this. I cut off a section of it and I just used a layer mask to hide the parts that I didn't want. Then I moved on to color grading it with a selective color. So selective color, if you don't know, is this adjustment layer right here. And when you click it, you can select specific colors. And I was going for this blue theme, so I selected the neutrals tab. And to make it a cooler tone, you would move the cyan to the right and then the yellow to the left, and you see how it gets bluer. So yeah, that's how I did that. All right, so going back to my mask, color overlay, that's an adjustment that I did later on. Then I used this image of a night sky with stars. That's what it looks like without the mask. And I just used, for this mask, I just used a soft brush set at like 20% and just erased the parts I didn't need. And then I went on with hue and saturation. I increased the saturation for this. Then I went back with selective color and did the same adjustments that I did last time. Then I wanted the night sky to fade to a black. And then I used a black and white adjustment layer to create this gradient of the blues going into black. Then I wanted to increase saturation again, so I did another hue and saturation layer, another one again. And then I added this space image. It's the same image from earlier, and I just used the clouds. And then I have this cloud brush. This brush is actually from the visuals of Julius. He's got a bunch of brushes. I really suggest this brush pack. And then the clouds, I believe I used 12. Yes, it was brush 12. So yeah, that's what I used for these brushes. And then I created the moon. I started off with this moon. I used the ellipse tool, held shift to create a perfect circle, and then pressed on the space bar to move it around, and then let go of the space bar to readjust it and move it around again, just so I can make that perfect selection, and then clicked mask whenever I thought my selection was good. And that's how I cut out round objects that are, perfectly symmetrical. Then I lowered the opacity of the moon because I wanted to make this really nice glow effect behind the moon, and I felt like it would be better if I just lowered the opacity and erased some of the edges on it. So the first layer behind the moon was a solid white circle with slight Gaussian blur. Not that much, as you can see, it's barely blurred out, but this just looks, to me, nicer than what it would look like if this was at full opacity like this. So this is the first layer. Then the second layer, I did the same thing but a little bit more blur, and then the third one I did more of a blur. And then I added an exposure adjustment layer. I put this all the way behind the moon because I didn't want it to affect the craters of the moon, and I didn't clip it to anything. I wanted to affect everything that's behind the moon layers. So I set the exposure to plus 1.61, and then I went in with a soft brush and brushed in more glow. And then for the moon, I changed its color a little bit. I added some more exposure, some brightness, contrast, color balance. And then I moved on to the lower part of the landscape, and I found this image right here, and I added this, and then I just erased the top section of it with a soft brush and a layer mask. And then I added a color balance layer adjustment, and this was just to increase the blues and then change the yellow horizon to more of a pinkish tone. And then I added this cloud image right here just to give more depth within the scenery. I then added some shooting stars. These are some PNGs that I found on Avada Elements, and I added those in. And then these clouds are actually brushed in from the same brush pack that I mentioned earlier, and I just painted in with a darkish blue color. And because the moon's so bright and so close, I created these highlights on the clouds by using an exposure adjustment layer and bringing it all the way up, and then I painted in with a soft brush, just slowly painting in on how I think the light from the moon would hit the cloud. And I adjusted those colors with a hue and saturation layer, and I made it a little bit more of a purple color just to give that blue and purple vibe that I was going for in the composition. And then here's a, you can't see it on the canvas, but this is a shadow layer behind the windowsill, and you can just tell right here it's a slight shadow. But those little things just help with the realistic appearance of your composition. And then for the windowsill, I actually did a lot of adjustments on the windowsill. So first thing I did was I had my black and white layer adjustment, just so I know the contrast that I need for my windowsill. And obviously, since it's the closest thing, it has to have a lot of contrast. So let me turn off the black and white adjustment layer. Then I did a brightness adjustment layer, increase the contrast. Then I added a shadow layer, which was basically just decreasing the exposure. Then this is where the shadows started coming into play. This is the inner shadow of the windowsill that's inside the room, and I did this with another exposure adjustment layer, brought it down to negative 2.39. Because it's so geometrical, I just used a rectangular marquee tool and then just selected like that and then masked it out just so I can have perfect edges. Then I did the shadows of the window frame. Then I added a color adjustment layer, and this is obviously a lot of blue and purple color adjustments to give that vibe that I was going for. Then I added some highlights, and with this I did an exposure layer as well, and I actually had a soft brush and went in, and because this was so geometrical, you don't have to just paint in with a mouse and try to be as perfectly straight as possible. You can actually, because this is so geometrical, you can actually click on your first spot, let go, hold down shift, click on your second spot, and it creates a perfectly straight line. So that's how I did all of these highlights right here. And then I created more highlights. These are more exaggerated highlights because the moon is very bright. Then I created another highlight adjustment. This is more for the windowsill. As you can see up top, it got a lot brighter right here, as well as down below it got brighter as well. As you can see, it fades away. I didn't paint the entire section right there. And then this is another layer of shadows that I did because I felt like it wasn't dark enough when it faded in. And then the window glow. So a lot of people ask me how I do this glow. So basically, I set a new layer. I have a white brush, and then I click, hit shift, hold it down, click my second spot. Then I go over here to the blending modes, and usually it's overlay. Sometimes I change the opacity depending on how strong it is, but basically that's how I do my glows. And then moving on, I decided to add a dresser because I wanted to fill up the room. I felt like the composition would be too empty with just a person in the middle. So with this, I did the same thing again with the black and white adjustment layer. I do this for every element, and then I fix the contrast. I did that with an exposure adjustment layer, and then I added the bluish tone with the color balance, added shadow, and the shadow has to get darker more towards the right because the light's gonna come out from above to the left. And then this is a soft highlight, so the light from the moon hits the top of the dresser. And then I added this edge highlight, which is basically, I copy the dresser, I click Control U, set it all to white, rasterize the layer, set the layer to overlay, then I click Control, clicked on the layer so it selects it, go up here to Select, Modify, Contract. I usually do about 2 pixels, that usually works for me. Then I click Select again, Inverse, and then I click the mask. I did this a little bit too skinny, but you get the point of how I did this. And then I just adjusted with the opacity. For the curtains, so for the first part of the curtains, I added this bright curtain right here, and I put it in front of the dresser. And then I added a brightness and contrast, increased the contrast, brought down the brightness. I then added a color balance adjustment layer, and then I added an exposure, increased the exposure, and painted in my highlights. And then I just copied that, flipped it over all the way to the left side, and that's what you get right here. And then for the poster, I added this episode 5 poster. I did a selective color, and then added an exposure adjustment layer, brought down the exposure, and just to make it darker overall. And then I went in with another color balance and adjusted the colors as well. Then for the cat. So for the cat, I had this image right here. One again with brightness and contrast, selective color, color balance, and for the soft body highlights, I increased the exposure just a tad and created my soft body highlights. And then I made my main highlights that are coming from the moon. Highlights on top of the head because the moon is shining over the cat's head. The highlights will reach above the cat's head. And then I put in the tail right here. These cat whiskers you can barely see are painted in. Painted in with a soft brush at a low opacity and used a color overlay to match the hairs of the cat. And actually you can see all these hairs right here. I already grouped it with the cat right here because I needed to. But all these fur and hair that's coming out of the cat is all hand painted with a brush. And then I added a subtle glow to the cat the same way I did for the windowsill. So there's the cat. And finally the girl. So for the girl, I used these two images. I used the top half of the first image and the bottom half of the second image and then blended them in together. So this is what it looked like before I blended them in. I just expanded the girl's lower part right here and blended them in together to seamlessly get this. And then I went in with shadows. So for the shadows, I painted them all almost to the very edge because the light source is coming from in front of her. So she's going to have some light on the sides of her arms, or the sides of her hair, sides of her shoulders and stuff like that. So I didn't do the shadows all the way to the edge, but because of that reason. Then I made the lower part of her body darker because it's going to have less light coming in. And then I created highlights for the girl. And since the moon is in front of her and a little bit above her, the highlights will reach the top of her head. And because it's directly in front of her, you'll only see rim highlights on her body. And before I move into the hair touch-up, if you can see, all these hair strands are painted in. You can kind of tell that they're not perfectly color accurate. You can't tell once the highlights are on it, but these are all hand painted. And I just did it with a soft brush set at the size of 1 for thin strands and size of 2 for thicker strands. And then I merged it all together, and that's what ended up looking like with the hair highlights. This is what it looked like without the hair strands that I painted in, and these are with the hair strands I painted in. There's a bunch of hair on her arm right here that I didn't really like, so I just used the clone stamp tool and touched it up, covered it up a little bit. I did the subject glow again. Then finally, to finish the entire piece off, I like to do color overlays. So the first part, I created this vignette with a dark purple and just painted it around with a soft brush on the very edges just to bring that focal point more into the girl. And then for the grain, so I don't use the camera raw filter adjustment layer. I actually create my own grain. To do this, you go down here, click solid color, choose a light gray like this, convert to smart object. I then go to filter, noise, add noise, Gaussian, set it to 25, set the screen to overlay, bring down the opacity until you get what you like. I feel like this looks a lot better than the camera raw filter adjustment. For the final edits, you just go to your very last layer like this, how I'm over the overlays group. You hold Shift, Control, Alt, E, and that combines all the layers. So then I go into my final copies. So these are all the versions I did with different camera raw filters and different subtle adjustments. And then we'll finally get to this final. So that's the end of the layer breakdown. I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a comment and subscribe for more Photoshop content. See y'all in the next video.